Hello, everybody. Once again, here's myself talking about LARP and theories and game theory. And today we're going to be discussing the notion of death and permanent death in LARPing. Now, for those of you not familiar with this, there is a subset of LARP, live action role playing, where a character has a limited number of times they can resurrect, which is to say that if you were playing a video game and you die, you've got 3 lives. Mario can die 3 times unless you find that one up. And then he's permanently done. You have to reset the game to start over at the beginning. In LARPing, it works very similarly, except the whole game doesn't reset, just you. So we can sort of establish how that works. Now, before I can really get rolling on this, it's very important to note that this is a topic which has been debated very loudly and very passionately from both the pro and the anti camps for as long as there has been a concept of permanent death in a game. I have not seen this topic ever stop being debated. Every now and then it gets resurrected again. Currently, we're going through one of those moments where it's sort of coming back to the forefront in one of the larger franchise games at Nero. I've been playing in other games where there is permanent death, which is nowhere near as forgiving as Nero's, but it hasn't ever raised that degree of trial and tribulation, if you will. So I'm going to kind of wander around a little bit with this one because I feel that this requires an exploration not only of the nature of death and permanent death. I don't really want to get into the out of game consequences of it. I feel that's been covered very well by other people and other venues. If you want to have a really good listen to a discussion about that, go look up LARPcast. It's by Mickey Golslaver and Bill Tobin. They did an episode in 2012 specifically dealing with that in permanent death, and they really touched in on all the sort of out of game consequences of, well, then players don't show up and people are invested in playing their friends. That's been addressed. And it's been addressed, in my opinion, very, very well. They touched on that greatly. And I'm probably going to make references to their podcast again because they had some really good one liners about how to address certain things that happen when you have permanent death in your game. I'm going to wander and touch on some popular culture points and a few other things. Now, if we're talking about Nero, which is really where this sort of got me back into this discussion again, at Nero, there is sort of a stage of death, if you will, uh, where for our characters first, if you're a brand new character, they don't really count your deaths. Now, I've never seen this in writing anywhere, but it's a long-standing Nero tradition. First-time players get unlimited deaths their first event, which has led to some pretty funny scenarios, some very funny situations. After that, you usually get one free death, which is to say, well, this is the first time it's happened to you, so here's a freebie, here's a little lagniappe, your little something extra. Thank you for playing, you've participated in death, you may return back to the general population of the game now. Then you start picking stones. And this is Nero's particular mechanic. Every game that has permanent death has some manner of mechanic to just determine where you're at with it. In Nero, you have a bag with 10 white stones. Every time you die, you take out a white stone, you put it in a black stone. So the odds of you picking out a black stone increase over time the more you die, which basically means that at some point you're going to pull a black stone and your character's dead. He's not coming back. That's it. That's the mechanic. Some games only allow 4 deaths, period. That's it. There's no randomization mechanic to it. They just have a flat sort of tax on death, if you will. And there's been a lot of theories about this, about why do we want permanent death? And there was always this sort of pervasive notion of, well, this will thin the herd and it prevents player creep and player power level is going to be very high. And this was addressed again by other people. But I'm going to add a little bit of a twist to this by saying that's a myth. At no point has player power ever been inhibited by permanent death, for the simple fact that we have seen characters who are exceeding, putting aside issues such as buying build or, plot blankets or chapter owner blankets or things like that, just characters who just survive. They got through whatever they needed to. And at some point, you're just saying, well, now what? Do we target them? Do we just accept that they're part of the game now? These are characters who are survivalists. And permanent death isn't a solution. It never has been. It's kind of like the stock market, if you think about it. There's this great quote about the stock market, which is, um, how does this go? Proof that past performance doesn't predict future results. And you can look back at a lot of the early days of any LARP, where players are starting at level 1, and when they don't have all their abilities and they don't have all necessarily, the healing or the life spells or things of that nature, there's going to be more death because they don't have all the tools in their box. As time goes on, more tools are added to the game, and suddenly there's a lot less. The survivability increases. It's like introducing penicillin. Before penicillin, lots of people died. After penicillin, the mortality rate decreases incredibly. And that's where you have to kind of look at these mechanics. So from that perspective, you're constantly, by virtue of time in and of itself is going to decrease the mortality rate of your game. That's just it. We're not going to see this. And when I talk about the myth of permanent death now, you never see it happen where it actually inhibits power progression. It doesn't inhibit player progression. Permanent death is there more as a flavor than a threat. And if it was there as a legitimate threat, let's consider this for a moment, that there was a real fear of constant mortality. If it was legitimately a fear, where's the chapter that collapsed because too many people permed? I've never seen a game where that happened. And don't even mean Nero, I mean any game. I can think of games where permanent death was actually a baked-in normal part of the game. And I'm talking more of not so much a fantasy LARP, but a Cthulhu sort of LARP, where live-action Cthulhu basically is like, hey, your character's going to go insane and will probably die. You should bring 3 or 4 of them over the weekend. And it was considered normal. Now, that, of course, is an extreme example, when death is that normal for permanence. When you've got a game where the goal is to invest in a story over a very long period of time, a span of years, sometimes decades, that's a big amount of time and investment. And I've talked about the notion of persistence and investment in my last video. Permanent death is, I think, the thing that goes and really gives the flavor to make player investment and player persistence, if you will, really meaningful. Travis Beacham has this great quote. There are no heroes in a world where heroes can't die. And Travis Beacham was the writer for the movie Pacific Rim. And I'm bringing this up because there had been this huge hue and cry on the internet when all these suddenly supporting characters became wildly popular. Suddenly people are devoting entire, Tumblrs and websites to building out like web comics and stories and things about how, no, those characters didn't really die. They're still here. Here's what's going on. And the writer of the movie said, no, they absolutely died. They died heroes. You can't be a hero unless there's the opportunity to not succeed. And that goes back to my very first LARP event when I had my new player coordinator, a young lady named Callahan, said, hey, you're here because everyone's going to have the opportunity to be a hero in some way, however you choose to do it. But that was really the reason to LARP. You want to be a hero. So it comes to this idea of, can you be a hero if you can't actually die? Does it actually have any meaning? So permanent death grounds you in a very, very real way. And I am in the pro camp for permanent death. I'm very pro permanent death in LARPs for that reason. Now, there's a lot of discussion about, well, players lose investment and players lose time. That's an out-of-game issue. And it's a big issue. It's important. It's worthy of discussion, but it has been discussed ad infinitum. And I don't want to discuss that so much today. What I'd like to discuss is, what are the mechanics of death, and is it actually adding to the quality of your player's experience? Are players who have to go through this process at some time actually still getting to participate and enjoy the game? during the process of death. Think about that for a moment. Let's look at Nero and death, and let's talk about this, because I feel this is something which has not really been harped on so much by the masses. It hasn't really been touched on so much by the more mechanical wonks like myself who like really look at things. And it's one of those things which I think has been almost taken for granted by the really extreme immersion and interaction people, which I'm starting to align myself with more as I get older. What happens when you die? Let's talk about Nero first. It's probably one of the more touchstone sort of games. A lot of people have played it for a very long time. So when you die at Nero, you get out a white headband and you put it on, and pop, you don't exist in the world anymore. You're a spirit. You're literally, this is the same symbol for out of game. So a player who has died or a player who is walking to their car looks exactly the same mechanically. Nothing changes there. No one interacts with them. No one acknowledges them. They don't exist anymore. You have ceased to be part of the game world. You have no impact on anyone. And no one has any impact on you. That's it. That player goes to a resurrection point, and mechanically that's going to be a circle of power. Basically, it's sort of denotated by a string of Christmas lights in the ground, usually around a cabin, and that's the Healers Guild. And they'll walk in and announce a spirit has entered the circle, because otherwise you're still an out-of-game player. You have to have an actual verbal cue for the people who can interact with the dead to acknowledge you're a dead person and not just someone who forgot their keys. So now you're there, and this begins the process of resurrection. Now, I'm going to go back to that first part about how you don't interact with them in a little bit, because other games have handled that differently. Let me talk on that now, actually. What happens if you could interact with people, when you could still impact the game? I'm currently involved with Arcane in Connecticut, and their death mechanic is to say, well, when you die, you have to get out these little LED tea lights, and that's your spirit candle. And you turn it on, and you walk back to wherever it is your resurrection point is. You still have this notion of this point of resurrection, this space or person or MacGuffin, if for lack of a better term, that lets your character return from the dead. All right? But the difference there is people can see it. They can see the spirit walking through. Now, the spirit can't talk, can't interact with people, but people can interact with it in the sense that they can see it. They can react to it. They can go, oh, no, that's my friend. That's our adventuring buddy. That's the captain of our guard. And already there's suddenly this increase in investment on the part of the players of the game. They're suddenly having emotional reactions. Or at least they're having reactions, period. Maybe it's not really emotional. Maybe it's just like, oh, well, someone died. That's bad. But they're still able to comment on it and see it. And it's not detached. It isn't divorced from gameplay. Death is a part of gameplay. You've integrated death in that aspect into gameplay. So you have that. In Germany, and this was related to me about at Conquest of Mythidia, they actually set up this tent maze, which you have to go into and sort of navigate your way out. And it's a very cool concept. I mean, there's a lot of cultures that have these sort of notions about how, well, when you die, you are confronted with the pattern of your life, where you have to navigate something to prove that you are worthy to pass on to the next world, or because they don't have a necessarily binary system, which I feel when you get into modernity, a lot of major views on the afterlife are kind of binary. You either wind up in a good place or a bad place, and that's it. Where when you go back far enough at different cultures, it's like, well, first you start out in kind of a neutral place, and even Christianity used to have that with purgatory. I don't know if it's still embraced so much these days by most canons, but and say, well, you need to sort of figure out, prove that you actually examined yourself enough and figure this out, and where do you go? And then there was multiple places you could wind up. It wasn't so cut and dry. So this is a very interesting thing mechanically, to sort of take that and say, well, you have to go through and navigate this tent maze, and there are NPCs in the tent maze who are either interacting with you and chasing you. There's ghosts chasing you. A very good friend of mine, Noah Mason, went through this, and He actually bribed one of the ghosts. And then the ghost said, well, fine, I'll help you. And then help them navigate his way through that. And that's an extreme level of interaction at death. And that was, death happened. He went to this place and then began that process. And that brings us to what is the resurrection process? So we can see that's a very high level of interaction to bring the character back to the world of the living. And if you fail your test or your task, I guess it could be considered a test, you die. That's it. You're a corpse. You're done. You're meat. We put you in the mud. Go get some different outfit on and have a new kit, change your weapon style. You're playing a new character now. So that's what happens there. And that's a sort of a festival. So it doesn't happen as often as a North American sort of Nero would, which can happen anywhere between 4 to 10 times a year, depending on the chapter and weather and the conditions of the campground. When you get to Resurrection at Nero, you walked into this circle and you go, the spirit has entered the circle. Ooh. And the person there, the people who are invested there, begin to interact with you. Now, you wind up with the first challenge, I feel, of resurrection as a mechanic. How does that person proceed with you? And in general, I found that there's two sort of ways most people tend to do this as a role play sort of system. The first is you get what I think of as the resurrection on rails. And the resurrection on rails can be like anything else. There's a lot of difference in quality. I've come to think of it as, the Iliad test, based on who's role playing with you. Whose translation of this are we getting when we're put on these rails towards resurrection? Basically, they're giving you a story, and you're going to sort of listen to this and react to it, but you're not really changing it. You don't role play back. It's fed to you, and you sort of go, where basically, they sort of examine your existence and bring you through, and they might talk to you a little bit beforehand, be like, well, how many times have you died? How did you die this time? How did you die last time? How did you feel at the moment? They might just pull some information out of you, but then they sort of do this thing and go forward, and you get it on the rails, which leads you to the point where you then reach into the bag and pull out the stone, and that's where they make a decision what happens. Did you perm? Did you not perm? And that's that. And I call this the Iliad test because of quality. Some people are storytellers. Some people are talkers. And a lot of people aren't. They're just not very good at making that sort of stream of thought come through, and they're able to power through and just keep it creative and keep this idea going. Or maybe they haven't actually thought about it at all, and they're sort of just trying to pull it out of the seat of their pants, whereas other people have said, well, okay, I'm going to have 5 or 6 sort of standard things, and we'll go along these things, and that'll be the rails that I run the train of this resurrection down. And the player will walk up the cars of the train as it travels down the rails till it ends up at their destination. And that's kind of how they do it. And when I'm talking about the Iliad, let me read this here. So I've got 2 copies of this, and these are both the same copy by the same translation. And it's the definitive translation. It's by a guy named Richmond Lattimore. And it basically hasn't changed since 1951. This is, in fact, the 1951 copy. The only reason I own this copy that was printed in 1996 is because my 1951 copy was disintegrating. And I want to read to you the opening first sentence. And it's a little run-on because Homer was performing this live. He had a live audience. This is theatrical. So these were the rails that Homer put you on as Richmond Lattimore translated them. Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus' son, Achilleus, and its devastation, which put pains thousandfold upon the Achaeans, hurled in their multitudes to the house of Hades, strong souls of heroes, but gave their bodies to be the delicate feasting of dogs, of all birds, and the will of Zeus was accomplished since that time when first there stood in division of conflict Atreus' son, the lord of men, and brilliant Achilleus. That's a hell of an opening line. Homer was one great talker. Clearly, this is the person you want giving your resurrection. You want a Homer. And that's Richmond Lattimore's translation of this. So there's a really good example of a talker talking about the conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon. Now, I don't have a copy of it, but I've never forgotten this. The copy of the Iliad we were given in high school, and this was like in 1993, because long ago and far away, the opening line was as follows: Achilles was very angry. Now let's let that sink in for a moment. We went from Sing Goddess, the wrath of the son of Peleus, to Achilles is very angry. And that's the Iliad test. A person who has the ability to really just spin a yarn and take you down those rails, you're going to come out of that resurrection experience, you're going to come out of the experience of having died feeling very satisfied. You got something very cool out of that. Oh, I got a story. It's kind of neat. It's all mine. That's neat. If you get an experience, and I've unfortunately had the not Homer experience, it's very unsatisfying. It's very aggravating, and you are left with this notion of, well, that really stinks. I never want to do that again. And it reinforces this notion of, and rather than saying play to lose, which a lot of us do, we embrace that death is a part of our game, and it's good when we die because that way we can go, oh man, did you see what I did there? And we had this great thing, and people will come up to you later and that was such a noble sacrifice, and it creates more interaction role play. Play to lose is a valid thing, but when you're rewarded with, instead of getting Homer's Iliad, you get Homer Simpson leading you to the bagel shop. That's not a very good reward. It's very bad. Now, I said there was another sort of thing. Rather than putting the story on rails, there's the interactive resurrection, where someone will start giving you almost a psychological profile where they'll be like, you awaken and you're on a gray road and the road forks. To the left there are trees, to the right there's a field, and in the middle of the road there's a puppy. What do you do? And it's this sort of psychological profiling of you. Basically, you're being given the Voight-Kampff test from Blade Runner, leading to your ultimate resurrection or permanent death. And that can be very cool as well. The Voight-Kampff method doesn't happen as much anymore because it requires someone in that resurrection point who can be very dedicated, who can really pay attention to you, and who's snappy. They're on the ball. They're paying attention. They have a good memory. They're remembering what you responded. If you've got someone who's doing it like it's on a checklist, going, okay, well, you touched the puppy, you spit on the field. Let me draw a line. That's not fun either. So suddenly, we're starting to find this notion that if a game wants to have people find death to be a mechanically rewarding experience, you need to invest time in training and talking and developing plot for death, much the same way you would for training your NPCs to fight or learning the rules, or if you're going to send someone out as the big talking monster boss on the field, you want to send your best talker out there. Well, you need to have that person now back here for people who die. You need to make sure you've got the right talent in that position, because those are talents that not everyone has or not everyone's developed. Was death fun? And that's a big part of this. If you die permanently, was that permanent death experience, the deaths you got along the way and the final thing, did it add to your experience of your story? Did you have heroic times? Were you acknowledged as such? And that is a big part of investing in your character as a player. There's certainly a lot to be said from the out-of-game standpoint, which again has been addressed by other people. Well, it affects monster scaling and plot scaling and all these other things. But ultimately, I feel mechanically, Death needs to be something which is as interactive as any other part of the game. From the moment your character, you know, their heart stops, they do whatever their mechanic is to get up and go to the thing which will allow them to begin resurrecting. The game still needs to acknowledge them. The game still needs to think like, oh, there's all these ghosts walking through. There needs to be something which says, wow, if you have a game which is driven by story, and I need to make that clarification. If your game is not driven by story, none of this matters. At that point, you're probably doing something more like a Dagahir or a Belagarth or something like that, and you're playing a sport. You're playing medieval role-playing sports. And there's nothing wrong with that. They're great. They're a lot of fun. But that's where people go, bing, 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 up, I captured the flag, up, I died, run back, boop, tap back in, run back out again. And it's basically like that. It's a different sort of thing. The SCA has been doing this for however many years the SCA has been in existence now. I've lost track. But, I mean, you have battles where, at Penzik, you can resurrect once or twice and come back in. Or maybe it's like a bridge battle where they go, nope, once you're dead, that's it. Get off the field. You had one and done. But you'll be back for the next battle. There's never a notion of, like, I've never thought of it this way, but I guess you could say the SCA is never going to do something where they're going to have a day of attrition where the battle goes, because at that point everyone, it's just going to turn into, well, you're going to wind up with like 200 guys left on one side and everyone's dead on the other side. Because there's so much attrition, you wouldn't be able to have that go for an entire day, let alone multiple days. I mean, that's that whole notion of, do you have enough people to take a punch? Or are you just really good at giving a punch? I mean, Dan Carlin's talked about that with ancient societies and fighting. So, in terms of these resurrection mechanics, it's got to be story driven. That's really the only reason, because your character's story isn't done yet. And that means dying has to be part of the story. You can't have this moment where, like, well, you were stabbed 15 minutes later, and you're back. Or those 15 minutes have something going on in them. There's been a lot of stuff in fictional literature where people encounter death and they interact with death, and some of it is humorous, some of it is serious, some of it is, of course, high drama. But it's there for a reason. It's part of the story. As a species, we've been anthropomorphizing death for as long as, basically since the point that we realized people are going to stop moving, and that's that. They're done. We are currently at a 100% mortality rate for all time, so everyone's going to go through this. We need to explain this a little bit, but it's still part of a story. So it's very confusing to me that when you look at this mechanically, why are we suddenly just purging elements of the story away from the rest of the game? Now, there's an argument which can be made, we want this to be a very personal and private experience. Well, fine. That's understandable. Their role play to bring them back can be very personal, but the fact that they're going there and the fact that they've died shouldn't be something where they no longer exist. They are functionally deleted from the game until they are, loaded from a backup at their resurrection point, and then they come back in again. And this begs other questions too, which I always thought very interesting, was how we don't require the recovery of the body. The body isn't important because mechanically that would be very difficult, and then you wind up having people who are left out laying in a field for an hour until they can recover a body. But wouldn't it be interesting if you had that sort of standing mechanic of, well, the spirit can come here and it takes so long. What would happen if you actually had a separate, perhaps faster mechanic if the body was recovered? And I don't mean like someone cuts off a piece and brings it back. I mean like the entire body is carried in and someone lays it on the table and they start trying to, role play surgery and do all these things, and they're pouring chemical potions down your throat, and they're going, no, we must bring him back. And suddenly that adds another layer to your character's experience. It wasn't that you were brought back by the gods or, the fates or whatever magical experience causes your spirit to suddenly coalesce into a body again. But they actually got your body to start ticking again. Boy, that would really add some different dimensions to you, wouldn't it? You might have some new scars to add to your character. You might have this horrifying experience of being like, I wasn't disembodied. I was here the whole time. I felt nothing. I was part of the void. Or you could go and say, I was very enlightened and everything was peaceful and I was calm. And, there's so many ways to go with that. But we haven't explored it that deeply. Some food for thought for game mechanics. Now, I mentioned Mickey and Bill earlier, and we talked about how really permanent death adds tension to a storytelling experience. That's a direct quote from Mickey. It's there to add tension, and I think that's really what it does. And ultimately, he had this other thing that he mentioned in this podcast, and it was you don't need death to make people feel in game. And he's 100% right with that, by the way. You don't need death to make people feel in game. You just need people to actually be invested in themselves and their characters and be present in the moment, as it were. I will say I'm going to add the following to it. If your game has death, then death needs to be 100% in game and as interactive of an experience as the rest of gameplay. And I think that's about where I would leave that. Now, thank you for listening to today's ramble, and hopefully I'll be able to keep this up. I believe we've got the issues with the microphone corrected because the microphone on the camera just doesn't work very well. So you'll get to see me wearing this fashionable headset. I'll probably keep rambling along about whatever comes to my mind as I come across them in the various forums on the internet. And if you have any questions or you have any comments about this or something you'd like me to sort of look into and start researching a little bit or do a little discussion on, I'd be happy to do it because I really enjoy this, and I've certainly enjoyed LARPing for 20 some odd years, and I feel that mechanically there's a lot of things we're starting to get into that need this deep exploration to really just get the best experience we can. Thank you for listening, everybody. Have a great day.